Hello and welcome to the Growth Mindset podcast with me, Sam Webster Harris. As always, diving into the psychology of self-improvement and today's topic of cognitive rigidity and the 5 cognitive biases that impact us here. I'm going to start us with a story to just outline some of the issues that we face. Everybody likes a story. Then I'll introduce how we're going to dissect the whole fascinating topic of cognitive rigidity. So I mentioned I have a story. Well, I am British, and you might well be aware that Britain has a slightly, I would say, unfair, but at least understandable brand for having terrible food. As a nation, our grandparents just had a propensity to boil to death vegetables, meat, anything really. And let's say that they just had some cognitive rigidity when it came to experimenting with things like texture, ingredients, and quite frankly, flavor. Despite the fact that now I love all food and even a lot of British food, I was rather fussy as a child and went to a school where you would be forced to eat any food you were given because waste not, want not. And it genuinely might have been one of the worst parts of my childhood. Honestly, I was sick several times, and by far the most amount of crying I have done over anything was just sat in front of inedible food. And much as I wanted to, I couldn't, for the life of me, force some of this weird, congealed, odd-looking stuff into my stomach. Every single part of me can vividly remember that when I was at school at around 10 a.m, the tendrils of scents wafting from the kitchens would creep into our classroom and I would know exactly what was being cooked. I could tell you which type of gross lamb we were going to have and just how bland the carrots would be. My stomach would start churning with terror at the upcoming trials it would be facing. And the most memorable event that really defines the stupidity of the entire affair and cognitive rigidity of British cooking and the school system was a battle I had one day with some horrendous cabbage that the teacher absolutely refused to let me leave. And as much as I swore that it was impossible for me to eat and cried and said I couldn't do it, he told me that it was impossible for me to leave until I ate it and that we may as well get on with it. And after a lot more crying and going in circles, I did manage to get a piece of this cabbage to the point of at least being inside my mouth, only to instantly explode in what I had already predicted would be me vomiting. And what resulted could only be described as modern art. I somehow created a perfect circle of vomit, and it was essentially a pie chart of the mashed potato on one side, peas and something else. And both the teacher and I just sat and stared at the contents of my stomach in this weirdly perfect circle for a few moments in surprise and wonder, until I was eventually informed that I could now go. So, as you can guess, I do have a personal beef with cognitive rigidity. Terrible pun intended. But it's not just British cooking and school system that is affected by cognitive rigidity. It is, in fact, incredibly pervasive, from the world's best scientists to the stupidest politicians, from our healthcare and just our everyday social interactions. In fact, we all have cognitive rigidity about lots of things, and in many ways, it even helps us navigate the world around us. Cognitive rigidity is described as the consequence of a lack of mental flexibility, and it could be defined as the inability to change behavior or beliefs even when they are ineffective at helping us reach an objective. So it's of course highly related to the fixed mindset, which we should be uncovering at every opportunity and trying to banish from our lives. So in this episode, we're going to cover the final 5 cognitive biases in the series: functional fixedness, the endowment effect, the bandwagon effect, hyperbolic discounting, and last but certainly not least, the Zeigarnik effect. We're going to learn how these different biases appear in our life, how they create cognitive rigidity, and how we might overcome them. And coming along with us for the journey is one of my favorite people from history, if not absolute favorite, Albert Einstein, who is going to help give a source of wisdom on how to overcome some of these problems. It's an absolute banger of an episode, if I say myself, and I found out a lot of things whilst researching it, so stay tuned. On to the first concept that I want to tackle today that underlies cognitive rigidity, and that is functional fixedness. It's a tendency to see objects as only working in a particular way and limiting our ability to use them in new ways. For example, thinking that the only way you can cook a vegetable is to boil it to death is one form of functional fixedness. Now, this concept was discovered in an experiment where participants were given a candle, a box of tacks, and some matches, and they were told to attach the candle to the wall so that no wax could drip on the floor. And if you're wondering what to do, well, you'll be pleased to know that most people didn't solve this problem either. The key was to realize that the box of tacks could actually be used for holding a candle if you just tipped all the tacks out of it and then used two of them to pin the box to the wall. But most of the participants just saw the box with its current role as holding tacks and didn't think of changing its function. So, as we see, functional fixedness gives us a fixed mindset to treat things as they are presented to us without questioning. And sometimes it's obvious. Imagine having a screwdriver and thinking you could only screw screws with it, even though you could use it as a lever to open a tin of paint, or you could hit someone on the head with it if you felt like it. It's pretty obvious. But actually, humanity has really fallen for this flaw in some big ways. If you've heard of the history of bloodletting, it used to be considered very good medical practice to just drain people of their blood for centuries after there was enough data showing that it probably wasn't helping. And another example of where we've really messed this up was at the start of World War I. Both sides had a lot of cavalry, and they sent millions of men to storm fortified positions because that's what they always used to do, despite the fact that machine guns then had completely changed the game and allowed the defenders to just mow everyone down. And the generals really hadn't learned to use the tool of their soldiers in a new way. They had a functional fixedness around how to employ them. And of course, you're not going to be sending millions of men to their death, but maybe you use a spreadsheet just for accounts when you could be using it for project managing. Perhaps you throw things out without realizing they could be useful. A shoebox could be turned into a really cool container, or an old shirt can be turned into a cushion case. Now, obviously you don't need to upcycle everything, and I don't want to be pressuring you to be some home builder goddess, but just thinking how you can use something differently can be a really good habit to overcome functional fixedness. Perhaps one of the big problems that we're still dealing with in society are things like gender roles, where we have expectations of how one person should act and what they can do compared to another based on their gender. And in fact, functional fixedness is an underlying cause of stereotyping in general, when we expect people to act and conform to some preconceived idea about them. Another area it gives us problems is science, and here is where we finally get to talk about Einstein as promised. He did a lot of work to wrestle with functional fixedness. He grew up in a world where Newtonian physics was everything. Newton's law of mechanics described the physical universe in terms of absolute space and time, and it had been uncontested for centuries. It was a tool, and so was physics. Physics was seen as a tool, in fact, to confirm these laws, not as a tool that could investigate breaking these laws. And throughout Einstein's initial education, he was ingrained with his principles, and it created a real mental block for him that made it amazingly awkward to conceive that Newton's laws of mechanics might not be true, and to come up with other frameworks. However, Einstein was a master of thought experiments, and he was able to just completely reimagine the established notions of the nature of space and time, which is incredible. And his famous thought experiment of riding alongside a beam of light led him to the realization that the speed of light must be constant at all times for anyone observing it, regardless of their motion relative to the light source. Otherwise, if you were traveling at the speed of light and then you shone a torch, the light from the torch would be going twice the speed of your light beam that you're riding on, and that would be crazy. This was something that hadn't been able to be answered before. And of course, Einstein had to back up his ideas with an incredible amount of theory and maths, but the completely novel insight fundamentally altered the understanding of space and time. Now, most of us aren't going to redefine the nature of physics, but for ourselves, we can still work to overcome functional fixedness. Firstly, by just practicing more divergent thinking, and that means engaging in exercises that promote creative ideas and force us to consider multiple uses for common objects. There's a really nice game you can just play with an elastic band to come up with how many different uses you can use it for. And we should also practice challenging assumptions. One of my favorite parts of running the show is that I have the license to jump into accepted dogma and see what's really true, because it turns out you don't need to wake up at 5 a.m. to be successful, and you aren't always a result of 5 people you spend time with, and the brain is not a muscle. And yet statements like this just get thrown around all the time, and it's really fun to just question them and separate the fact from fiction. Finally, something else we should do is just expose ourselves to new experiences. This could be travel, hobbies, learning new skills. When you get exposed to different cultures or practices and perspectives, it really helps broaden your thinking and reduces the likelihood of falling into functional fixedness. And I'd recommend to anyone to try breaking out of whatever is their normal routine for them, at least for a little bit, and spend time in a completely different part of the world. Because it's so easy to fall into bubbles and not even see that we are in a bubble until you get out of it. And I think that's enough on functional fixedness, and I'm excited to move on to the endowment effect. Imagine you have an old and rather worn teddy bear. For me, it's Spot the dog, and he went with me everywhere as a toddler. For us, our teddies are priceless because of the memories they hold, but to others, it's just a used toy and it's lame. And so, personal ownership of something can really inflate the perceived value of it. In this scenario, I think it makes lots of sense, but it can get a little irrational. Dan Ariely did a cool experiment with basketball tickets where some participants won a ticket to a high-profile basketball game, and when they were asked the price that they would sell the tickets for, they priced it much higher than any other participant would buy a ticket for, although presumably they would never have paid that much for the ticket, or even pay half the price. So you think they should be willing to sell it cheaper if they had a rational way of thinking about money, and money always had the same value to them, but suddenly the value of the ticket changed because they now owned it. Once they have the ticket, they start to feel a loss aversion and a sense of ownership that makes the perceived value of it much higher. And it's not just the value of things in monetary terms where we start to get confused. People have fallen out over parking spots because they've got so attached to them. In fact, the endowment effect can be triggered just by touching things. This is why Apple will let you play with their phones in the store, because you become a little bit attached to it. I might go a little bit rogue here and present a personal idea, but I think a lot of tribalism and patriotism has a big relation to the endowment effect. We perceive some extra value in the group we are in for no rational reason other than that's where we are, so it must be the best. Just because you grew up in a city doesn't mean that city's football team is the best team. Obviously, it just happens to be the one that you're around. Just because you grew up in a country doesn't make it the best country. And yet we have this irrational idea that it must be. And personally, I've just always found patriotism a little bit absurd, and that has nothing to do with the terrible British school food. I think it's just because I traveled so much, saw so many happy people with completely different ways of life, that it became really obvious that no one way of doing things could ever be the best. Anyway, the endowment effect also affects investors in stocks or house owners, where we find it hard to sell things for the same or less than we paid because we feel it must be worth much more, even if the market says that it isn't. And I don't have time to fully go into the psychology of things like hoarding, but it is, of course, deeply related. And Einstein actually struggled a lot here. He was known to have a little bit of a hoarding propensity. He kept hold of all his original manuscripts, personal correspondence, and even minor calculations and odd scribbles. And to be fair, if I'd won a Nobel Prize for my odd ideas, I'd probably want to keep hold of everything I'd ever written. So I don't think this is that unreasonable a behaviour. And personally, I found it hard enough to get rid of my school notes and odd drumsticks that I'd caught at gigs from bands I don't even remember seeing. So I feel perfectly happy for him to preserve his scientific legacy and not want to give it away or sell it. Good for him. One thing that Einstein possessed that he certainly did let go of was his German citizenship. He was born a German and also a Jew, and as the Nazis came into power, he no longer felt welcome in his home nation because he wasn't welcome, and he ultimately fled to the United States, where he became a citizen, and he stayed there for the rest of his life. And he was, of course, quite sad about it, but he also found it easy to be objective because given the scenario, it seems obvious that he wasn't going to value this nation that rejected his entire people. But what about the rest of us? Can we overcome the endowment effect and be more objective about the real value of our possessions and our investments, for example? Nat Eliason, the author of Crypto Confidential, which I think comes out this week, and it's a great book that I am very glad I got to read ahead of time, he has a really good framework in it for crypto investments, where crypto, obviously, it's very easy to get confused of what the real value is of stuff because it's a bonkers place to be. He says that you should try and imagine that someone is willing to give you a wad of real cash right now in your hand, and just imagine it as like a pile of money in front of you, whatever investment that you have and whatever its current market rate is. And if the current market rate is a pile of money in front of you that's so big that you really can't say no to it, you should just sell, because it's easy to get lost in things and constantly think that they're going to go up or whatever. And it doesn't matter. Like, ultimately, if it was the other way around and you didn't have that investment and it was your cash that you were going to be paying for it, you should probably be selling it instead of holding on. Another thing we can do is to culture a little bit more decluttering and minimalism. So maybe don't repurpose your shoeboxes into containers and throw them away, and screw what I said earlier. Regular clear out is very refreshing, and at least if nothing else, you can probably throw out your old maths homework, as you probably aren't Einstein after all, sorry. And yes, it took me 20 years to get round to it myself. Moving on to the bandwagon effect after the break. Imagine you see everyone around you wearing a ridiculous new style of jumper or sporting a mustache. Even if you don't like these jumpers or mustaches, you realize that in fact it could look good on you, and you try it out just for fun. And now, welcome to the rest of your life, spent wearing granddad jumpers and supporting a dodgy mustache that no one likes. The bandwagon effect is where we tend to believe or do things because many other people do the same. And here we are going to start digging into social influences on our decision making, and this also certainly connects into our tribalism and feelings of belonging to a group. There are some crazy experiments from psychology where people would administer high voltage shocks to individuals because everyone else was doing it, or they'd agree that two lines of clearly different lengths were the same length because that's what everyone else said. But I think there are some nuances behind peer pressure to do something versus truly believing something. And things like stock market bubbles are in some ways a better example, where the entire market becomes irrational as they believe that incredibly inflated assets do have value because they keep seeing it go up in value. Whether this is tulip mania, the dot-com bubble, or the NFT craze, there's this feeling of safety in numbers and a distinct fear of missing out if you don't join the bandwagon. And it's something you see across history, is that people do tend to seek safety in numbers. Interestingly, for Einstein, he had to really work hard against the bandwagon effect because everyone believed in Newtonian physics. Perhaps because all the oldest and wisest physics minds of the day had spent their entire lives working within Newtonian physics. They didn't want some young upstart messing everything up with new ideas. Yet, when he in turn became an old figurehead, he resisted the early work in quantum mechanics from the new waves of scientists. Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg proposed some fairly radical ideas that particles exist in a state of probability until they are observed, which sounds as mad as it is, and Einstein thought that this was ridiculous. And despite the fact that he'd been a major factor in disproving God, he then turned about and gave the pithy quote, "God does not play dice with the universe." In fact, Einstein even created a paradox he thought to disprove quantum theory, but it turns out he was wrong and really influenced by the prevailing scientific norms and his own deeply held beliefs. It was, after all, Einstein who said that all useful scientific work is only done by those in their 20s. So you think he'd have been more open-minded to being wrong, but heyo, you can't get it right every time. And as I say, when you are in a bubble, it's very hard to see out of it. And the bandwagon effect really does create a warped sense of reality. And I find it a really fascinating one, because it bleeds into a lot of our lives and what we do. Do we really want to use social media and spend 3 hours a day sucked into a screen, or is it because our friends have it? Do we really want to follow the career path our parents are proud of, or are we just following the convention laid down for us? And if you're intrigued to learn more about things like social pressure versus defining your own destiny, then my episode a month ago on social pressure personality disorder is honestly a really fascinating listen, where I treat social pressure as if it was a hypothetical personality disorder and what we should then do about it. Regardless, wherever possible, I do always urge people to just examine their own interests and ideas for themselves to find rationality and to try and remove ideas that are planted into their minds by tribes and people that we follow. And now we can move on to a well-documented plague of humanity, hyperbolic discounting. This is politely defined as the tendency for people to prefer smaller, immediate rewards over larger, delayed rewards. Or less politely, that we are lazy, dumb dopamine addicts who will be easily distracted by cheap and easy satisfaction compared to longer term toil for greater success. We will take the slice of cake over going to the gym. We'll watch movies, tidy our room, even tidy our friend's room over revising for our exams, and we will throw money at the new iPhone, iPad, whatever, instead of throwing money into our savings. Considering our propensity to hyperbolically discount, you can see why things like Stoicism is having a bit of resurgence, because it is kind of smart, and half of the entire philosophy of Stoicism is basically just being anti-hyperbolically discounted. Interestingly, I tried to work out what the opposite word for hyperbolic discounting would be, and the opposite of a hyperbolic curve is an elliptic curve, and the opposite of a discount is premium. So logically, the opposite of hyperbolic discount is the somewhat catchy phrase elliptic premium. So I could try and start the elliptic premium philosophy, but I don't think it's going to catch on and make me famous. So we can move on from my terrible ability to name things and conclude that Stoicism is fine. Back to the topic. When we look at society, there are plenty of entities and just major fundamental parts of how the world works that is due to leveraging hyperbolic discounting. Credit cards and credit card debt exists because companies can take advantage of our tendency to fall for hyperbolic discounting. Smoking is one of the most widespread addictions on the planet that leverages the fact that people want to kick the can down the road, even though they know it's something they shouldn't be doing. Or we could, of course, examine how we look after the environment, or more accurately, how we don't look after the environment. So I doubt I need to quote any specific psychology at you to convince you that this phenomenon exists, and you have probably heard of the famous marshmallow experiment where kids were given the option of a single marshmallow now or 2 marshmallows in 10 minutes time. And unsurprisingly, the kids that could wait for 10 minutes for a bigger future reward went on to do much better at pretty much everything in their lives. Well, there is a really cool, different experiment that I feel should be printed at the front of every diet book as a warning. In this experiment, the conductors gave people the option to plan what snack they would be given in a week's time. They could have a healthy snack, like a piece of fruit, or they could have an unhealthy chocolate bar. And because this was in a week's time, most people chose the healthy thing. They made a plan that their future self would deal with, and lo and behold, 1 week later, at the time of receiving their snack, the experimenters kindly offered the participants, if they actually wanted to choose a different snack, they could, of course, choose healthy or the chocolate bar. And weirdly, despite the participants having their plans laid down for a whole week ahead, most suddenly decided to switch last minute to eat an unhealthy snack. Because now, in the real cold light of day, what they actually wanted at that moment in time, it was the unhealthy option. And who knows, maybe next week they'd get round to eating something healthier then instead, and that could be another problem for their future self to deal with. And I think this experiment really captures the essence of why most diet books are kind of useless. It's so easy to write a plan of anything that makes sense from a calorie model, and if you follow the diet, you'll be thin. And it's easy to read through this diet book and be exciting yourself with mental masturbation. But then even if you do stick to a diet for a while, it's a short-term lie that doesn't solve a long-term problem. Your health is a long-term game that you play for your entire life. It's not a short-term game that you can win in 1 month or 3 months and then your job is completed and you can return to whatever you like doing instead. You have to actually want to make healthy choices for the rest of your life. And any diet book that's selling you a short-term diet is just robbing you of the reality that you actually are going to have to change how you live. And on this topic, I've been watching a great show on Netflix called Mania, and it's a comedy all about a woman who's going on a health binge for all the wrong reasons and her journey to learn to actually take health seriously. It's really well written and pretty funny. So Mania is a top tip for anyone out there that wants to enjoy something lighthearted, but with an underlying deeper meaning. I am sure you are now wondering, what about Einstein? Well, there is an interesting example here from Einstein's personal life. After he finished his education, he failed to find a permanent academic position, despite his incredible IQ and being abundantly full of ideas. In fact, he didn't really put a lot of effort into fixing the problem that he hadn't found a reliable academic position, despite a lot of his mentors saying that he was a scientist through and through and he needed a tenured position to do his true work. Instead, he took temporary jobs to pay the bills and worked in a patent office, which solved his immediate question of employment and gave him lots of free time. He figured he'd deal with the academic stuff later. And you could definitely argue that this was hyperbolic discounting, although in this case, I would say that it actually worked out quite well for him because he was really prioritizing free time for science. He had the flexibility in his free time to work on whatever he wanted to work on. And in this case, this was his mind-bending new ideas in physics that led to his annus mirabilis, or his miracle year, where he wrote 4 of the most impactful scientific papers in history and earned himself a Nobel Prize from it. But despite the fact that he'd written these papers, it took 10 or so years for them to become widely accepted and even longer to win a Nobel Prize. So although he'd published these incredible ideas, in his early life he had a lot of financial instability and professional uncertainty, and it took a while for his career to kick off, even though he'd written 4 of the most impactful papers to ever be written in science. Because the rest of the scientific community took a while to catch up with him, and he was just this poor dude working in a patent office that had no other scientific recognition behind him. And apparently he'd written some papers that were genius and rewrote the laws of physics, but people found it very easy to dismiss him because he hadn't really prioritized to even try looking like a scientist. And he genuinely might have had an impact faster if he'd taken the more official routes instead of prioritizing quick money and free time. But we will never know what would have been the best way for him, and what he did do did certainly work out for him, and I certainly wouldn't argue that it was a decision based on pure laziness. So I'm kind of giving him a free pass here. And you might accuse me of favoritism if you wanted to, and it might be accurate. So we can move on to the last cognitive bias and just cleaning some things up after the break. Okay, so I'm sure you are aware we have one final bias to go, and that will finish the epic list of the 30 most important cognitive biases that I have been getting through over the past 2 months. And I genuinely think this last one might be the best of the lot, and I am excited to dig into it. And if you have missed the rest of the season and you like this episode, I'm sure you will love the other episodes in the series if you haven't listened to them yet. They're each marked with cognitive bias at the end of the title. One thing I want to do with this episode is to end it on a really tidy note, so I'm going to shake things up a little bit right now and give a super speedy 30 seconds of housekeeping before we round off the season to end on a big note. If you are enjoying my style as a podcaster and curious explorer of psychology and you want to help the podcast, I'm getting to know my listeners a little bit more, and you can book a call for free on Wednesday afternoons. I will be transparent here and say it is basically just audience research for me, and getting to know some of the real people behind these millions of downloads I have is incredibly useful to understand what makes you all tick. Of course, if you do have any questions on life decisions, relationships, mindset, business, I'm happy to talk about whatever confuses you or interests you, because that helps me understand you. So, link in the description. Then, of course, I'm a podcaster, and like all podcasters, a good review or sharing of this episode is one of the most useful things that you can do and is very much appreciated, and I'm not going to go on about that anymore. If you do find yourself wanting more on the topics we've discussed today, then recommended books are in the description, and you can check out my sponsor Shortform for a summary of the world's greatest books to try before you buy. And now, drumroll, onto the final cognitive bias. Have you ever read a book so good that you couldn't put it down, and perhaps turned into a slightly obsessed demon who struggled to concentrate on anything and just raced through the novel in a matter of days until you could finally resume normal behaviour again once it was completed? And if that doesn't resonate with you, Have you ever ruminated on something and stayed awake all night tossing and turning with an unfinished task, gnawing away at your thoughts? Well, you may have been suffering from the Zeigarnik effect. We can almost always remember incomplete tasks and tend to increase our attention towards them and mentally rehearse them. But what's really interesting is that we easily forget completed tasks. And to put it simply, incomplete tasks stick around in our memory longer than completed tasks. Scientists found that if they let people tackle a few different tasks and they completed some of them and deliberately interrupted people halfway through other tasks, they'd remember the details of the interrupted task twice as well as the ones that they had completed. And this was so interesting that they did a follow-up study, and they found that when people are given the option to work on any task, regardless of how interesting the different tasks were, people would always gravitate towards taking on a task that was unfinished that they'd already started. And to try and picture this in your head, you could imagine your mind as a series of open loops. Unfinished tasks are like open loops that just keep running in the background, constantly reminding you of what needs to be done and the details about them. And it's a bit like an app running in the background on your phone, taking up processing power, and the really heavy apps making your phone overheat and just become useless at everything. And there's something really satisfying about once you complete something and let it go and just turn it off. I'm sure you've had essays for an important assignment and you just couldn't stop thinking it over until the essay had been submitted. And then you could finally rest, knowing there was nothing more you could do and you can just let go. And we love the feeling when our mind can completely drop all the ruminating about something, whether that's improving a performance or adding some details to it. It's so nice to be able to forget about it. And it turns out we do just forget about it once it feels complete. So if we frame this bias as a cognitive filter that allows us to shut off rumination about absolutely anything and everything, and instead it only makes us ruminate about things that feel unfinished, then it's actually kind of quite a useful bias in some ways. But of course, this doesn't help you at night when incomplete tasks are stressing you out, but it does offer a path to a solution. It turns out you don't actually have to do the specific task as much as give yourself an idea of completion of something like the task. If you grab a pen and paper and write down a plan of what you need to do, that can get all these unfinished tasks out of your head and create a sense of completion that no longer requires ruminating, and you can give yourself some peace. Another really useful point of advice here is to try and avoid too much multitasking in your life and taking on too many projects at once, and focus on one thing at a time. If you are working on lots of little bits of things, it's lots of unfinished stuff whirring around in your brain, taking up background space and processing time, and it actually makes you much less effective at the thing you're doing, even if you are focusing on it. Much like your phone becomes a bit useless when you've got like 20 other apps all doing things in the background. And I can certainly talk about this for myself. I'm so much more effective if I have one big task for the day and my only real goal is to get that done. And if I try to do 5 different things, I often don't really make any progress on any of them. I think one of the big reasons actually that being a founder of a business can be so stressful is that there are just always so many different tasks going on to hold in your head. And a lot of them can't even be fixed. And you have to learn how to let a bunch of fires carry on burning if you're ever going to sleep at night. And I think perhaps for the same reason, doctors can't be too empathetic. Otherwise, they'll feel personally responsible for the health of every person they've ever met, which will just completely overload them with endless open loops. Anyway, what we learn here is that multitasking is bad. And if you have a role that requires involvement in a lot of different areas, you need to learn ways to compartmentalize things and detach from different areas to be able to stay effective. Another fascinating point here that I'm realizing about the Zeigarnik effect is relationships. If humans love completing tasks, closing loops, when we start a relationship in the first 6 months, it's like a story that we're still finding out about. This new person in our life is that book that we can't put down. And I think relationships that end early can sometimes be just as hard to heal from as a long relationship because of the feeling of unfinished business. And regardless of a relationship's length, if you felt like there was something left to explore, the Zeigarnik effect is there, making you ruminate on this unclosed loop. And because it's such an important one, it's so hard to put it down. It's not like an essay with a submission deadline after which we can just put our feet up. There's always a thought left unsaid, and we have to wait for time to allow us to prioritize other thought loops as this relationship one slowly gets put to bed. I've never heard anyone speak about this before in relation to the Zeigarnik effect, but it makes so much sense now that I've thought about it. I'm sorry to say that I'm not sure how helpful it is, but I think it does help us realize that closing the loop is a priority, and doing anything to give you closure is important. Honestly, when you start looking at the bigger picture of human behavior, there's so many things with how we act that they're related to people seeking closure, to turn off their ruminating, people seeking justice for something they never used to care about, or trying to resolve an argument. Or what about social media? If you put a post out there, that creates an open loop, and you'll open your phone 7 gazillion times after you've made this post to see if people are commenting and liking it. And I feel like one of the things that makes social media so addictive is the fact that it's constantly creating more and more open loops for you to be constantly worrying about. And then, as we spoke about in the episode earlier this week about the games we play in life, is the game you're playing a game that you can go towards a target where you can rest afterwards? Or is it something that is a continuous open loop where you just keep on aiming for more? Is there an amount of money where you can rest and feel good at? Or do you keep working and seeking more in an endlessly unresolved loop? Narcissism, in fact, is an unresolved attachment wound that leads people to an unclosable loop of seeking validation. So we find ourselves now looking at the Zeigarnik effect as something that initially sounded like a funny cognitive bias that causes us to get a little obsessive about books, but actually points to some of the underlying causes behind unhappiness, greed, and the hedonic treadmill of the human condition. It certainly points to seeking refuge in things like Stoicism, Buddhism, growth mindset, therapy, meditation, journaling, and any sort of sensible place to learn how to be more at peace. And this is just really cool because I love understanding the truer nature behind why things that are supposedly good for us are actually good for us, because I find being told what to do has never really worked for me, but understanding why you should do it is so much more satisfying and more compelling for me. So I feel like this was a really great finding that is a really helpful nudge to make me pursue some of these healthier practices more. Okay, now I'm wondering if many of the observant amongst you have noticed that I've deliberately chosen the Zeigarnik effect as the last cognitive bias to discuss, because it's all about the topic of incomplete tasks, and I am completing the task of cognitive biases, which does have a lovely feeling of resolved completeness in my head. But if you're worrying that you're now going to forget everything because I've completed it, one of the best things you can do for memory, besides leaving a task incompleted, is to start a new task where you then put into practice everything you've learned. And if you've enjoyed learning about all these different cognitive biases as much as I have, much like a book that you get obsessed over and then feel a bit sad when it's over, fear not, because now that we know them all, we can start to apply them to some bigger, meatier topics in the second half of this season. Surprise! We're going to cover things like our fundamental personality and how biases block us from changing who we are into who we could be. We're going to learn about tribalism, racism, media, and politics, and how they all tease on different cognitive biases and how we can truly become a rational and independent thinker. So I'm very excited for the second half of the season, and this has really just been a prelude to help us get there and do it more justice. And I think it will cultivate a very growth mindset attitude for anyone who values curiosity and understanding themselves. And now, to put the cherry on the cake, let's get back to Einstein. He was known for his habit to returning to unresolved problems. He really had to have an answer for anything and everything, and you could say that the Zeigarnik effect is a contributing factor behind most works of genius and innovation that have ever happened. However, in Einstein's later years, he persistently revisited his uncompleted unified field theory, which aimed to unify general relativity and electromagnetism and create this grand explanation of how everything in the universe worked. This unfinished work constantly occupied Einstein's thoughts, and it drove him to dedicate significant time and effort to solving it, even whilst lots of other scientific paradigms were shifting and creating bigger and bigger holes in what was already a theory that he couldn't make work. Despite the fact that he had many considerable accomplishments to his belt, his late age was just occupied by this unfinished work on the unified field theory and his quest to have an explanation to everything, which was unfortunate in that he was looking in the wrong place. Also, in his older age, he became quite political and sought to create a world government and prevent anything like World War II happening again, which I think is a perfectly reasonable thing to be doing. He sadly fell very ill when he was 76 and was hospitalized with an abdominal aortic aneurysm. At the time, he was halfway through writing a speech for a television appearance which would be commemorating what was going to be the 7th birthday of the State of Israel. Despite the important implications of his health, he still took the half-written speech with him into hospital as one of his unresolved open loops. However, once he got there and things turned out to be very serious, and despite the fact he had several open loops going on like his unified field theory, his political plans, and his half-finished speech, he told the doctors not to intervene, and he was finally able to make peace with all these pesky ruminations. He in fact stated, "I want to go when I want to. It's tasteless to prolong life artificially. I've done my share. It's time to go. I will do it elegantly." And I hope, like Einstein, you are able to make peace with the many ruminations bouncing around your mind. And ideally, I hope that you can do it more than a few hours before you die, as life is too short for constant rumination. And on that, this has been another episode of the Growth Mindset podcast, diving into the curious sides of psychology and self-improvement. Both the growth mindset and self-improvement can feel like an endless open loop, and I hope that I create content that helps you feel more at peace and curious about it all, rather than feeling a permanent anxious rumination that you're not good enough, because that would be the opposite of the point. So remind yourself that you are enough and to be kind to yourself. Enjoy your day and remember that everything is okay and you are exactly where you are meant to be. Thanks for listening.